How's it going, Woods and Forests community? I can't wait to get into this episode and talk with a professor of mine at college right now and also a mentor, Rick Hoch. But before we do that, I just want to break down what's going on. We're actually going to transition from season 2 to season 3 because we've had so many episodes and we're trying to start something new with this episode. So we're actually going to just move on and go to season 3, starting with Dr. Hoch's episode. He talks about geospatial sciences, what we're learning in the departments at Indiana University of Pennsylvania. He talks a little bit of backstory about who he is and different things that inspired him to get into this field. And we just had a really good time talking with Dr. Hoch. I can't wait to have him come back on the podcast. So just wanted to give you guys this update. It's going to be through all 4 of the segments that Dr. Hoch has, and then we'll go forward accordingly. But now we're in season 3, and I can't wait to share this episode with you guys. So sit back and enjoy a really awesome conversation that you can hear dialect between myself and a professor, and check out what we're learning in class. But that's going to do it for this. I can't wait to see you guys. And don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and we'll see you in the next one. Thanks.
Well, I'm a geographer and I love geography, right? Number one, I'm a geographer, number one. We're a bit of generalists and academic and research oriented. The planning side was about taking that general knowledge and applying it to be an agent of change, right? So how can you influence change? So if we're talking about conservation planning, right? I'm working with some biology faculty and who do conservation planning. We do conservation planning. We deal with the process and the legalities of what's enabled we can do within the confines of law and policy to move forward the change, the positive change we want to see in the world, right? And so what's that process? If we're just scientists and we collect a bunch of data and we do a lot of good analysis and we understand our science, how do we take that and put it into a process for positive change at the local level, from the federal government, state government, local government? Right. So the planning side of our department is a professional program in which students that would come to this program would want to be that agent of change, right? Whether it's for conservation purposes, we have, I'm interested in water resources. That's my interest. I want to make positive change in the world for better water. We all need water. Usually when I go to a public meeting, my first question is, who here doesn't like clean and fresh water, right? So nobody's going to raise their hand. Everyone likes clean and fresh water. The same could be said for air and all the other things that give us the ability to live on this floating rock, right? So I work with water, but some people are interested in neighborhoods, which is much more of an urban type of environment. I deal with urban environments, but I deal with water resources in an urban environment. People in urban environments want clean and fresh water also, and they want habitat where they can go. They want landscapes where they can go and get away from the urban hustle and bustle, right? They want to go maybe sit down by the creek and enjoy some fresh air and some nice sounds of a babbling brook, right? That is a spiritual, in any way you want to define that, resource. Right? It's not only a water resource or a natural resource. It is a cultural and spiritual resource for human beings. And so we look at it more holistically rather than just scientifically. Right? Science is a big part of what we do, of course, but we look at how do we take that science and those outputs and put them into some policy vehicle for people to accept change in their community. So we're still doing that in our new IUP alignment. We're just putting it into a different paradigm framework. It's about sustainability and climate resilience. And truly that's where all of this is going, right? How are communities or a watershed, it doesn't have to be a community of people, it can be a community of environmental resources at a watershed. How are they resilient to climate changes and weather patterns that are changing as a result to climate modification? And that's how we're looking at things. Does that make sense to you guys?
Oh, for sure. Yeah,
Okay,
I
great.
I did have one question, if that's okay, there.
Yeah.
So coming from somebody who isn't very familiar with geography, other than, you know, an 8th grade geography class, and actually being out in the wild, but looking at it from like a either a financial or like a business standpoint, I imagine a lot of the students that go through IUP and other schools for geography for like their master's degree, they're eventually trying to get into something that's more commercial. Is it, you know, is it that development commercial companies are looking for people who can look at landscape and see, can we actually build here? Is, you know, all the logistics of actually getting something deployed other than just conservation and, um, you know, national parks and state parks and the such? Is it a pretty broad career path?
There
That
are
people
many career
take?
paths in what we do. Yes, Josh, that's a good question. And let me address a couple things if I could.
Sure.
What you mentioned, site suitability is what we call it. Where's the best place to put something? And that could be an environmental suitability. Where's the best place to put a new Marcellus shale rig that's going to tap into our shale resources and produce natural gas? Where's the best place to put that? Maybe not just for tapping the gas, but to have the least amount of environmental impact. We call that site suitability and suitability planning. Maybe it's the best place to put a McDonald's, right? So that's an economic site suitability. It has little to do with impacting environmental resources, but it has a lot to do with picking the right spot to maximize your economic investment of a new McDonald's. And it might not even be a McDonald's. It might be an ATM machine, right? They do a lot of site suitability for that. The old joke was McDonald's spends a lot of money in using geographic information systems to do site location analysis. They spend tens of millions of dollars a year to determine where's the best place with the most traffic and the most disposable income and the most age targets and all those population profiles of people. Where's the best place to do that? They spend tens of millions of dollars a year to do that. Burger King, they don't spend any money doing it. Why? They just go where McDonald's goes. If let McDonald's do all the site suitability, right? So there's different kinds of site suitability that are geography. They're not all environmental and conservation. They can be economic. Right? We had a recent graduate student who came out of our department, and he was doing site suitability for Med Express. That's who he went to work for. Where's the best place to open up new Med Express offices? So it's the same type of analysis. You're just using different variables, whether it's environmental impacts you're trying to decrease or economic impacts that you're trying to increase. Second thing, if you're talking about conservation, where's the money at in conservation? It's right now, probably in my estimation, it's in what's called ecosystem services and banking on those services. So it's commodifying it's putting a monetary value on, say, a wetland, right? You might think, well, a wetland's a great place. We want to conserve it because it's a great habitat for frogs and toads, birds, insects. But that's not going to cut it, right? We need to have some way to incentivize people economically to conserve that. You just can't say it's worth saving alone. And so what's the service that particular resource, in this case, a wetland, provides in terms of economic savings? So for instance, if you have a wetland in your community and there's efforts to fill it in. Of course, that's not easy to do with our Clean Water Act and waters of the United States and all of those things. But let's just take a hypothetical. There's an effort to destroy that wetland or impact that wetland. Now we look at that wetland as not just a habitat. We look at it as a flood storage. And what's the value of that flood storage when we have a high rain event? Right? What's the value that wetland brings to a community in terms of dollar amounts and what it does in mitigating floods and reducing floods or eliminating floods? If we got rid of it, if that wetland was gone, how much would that community have to invest in flood proofing their community and stormwater management? So it's looking at what's called the ecosystem service of the natural environment, putting a commodity on it, putting a modification or a monetary value on it, and then you sell those credits. You can sell those. So they're banked and they can be sold within that watershed or hydrologic unit. That's happening. There's a mitigation bank right here in Indiana County. I think the PennDOT regional office is the mitigation bank for the region. And they bank wetland credits and stream credits. Now, you can't do that for cultural resources like, well, you can. I mean, they do that, I guess, for cemeteries and things where they try to centralize them. So, and I'm not an expert in that, but I do work with some students doing that. So cultural resources for a new development of some kind, there might be some cemeteries or graveyards, which are subtly different. So there might be an effort to put them all together, so you don't have them spatially distributed and put them all together. That's different for wetlands. You don't really want to do that, but that's what happens. That's one of the negative sides for that. So there's all kinds of economic gains that can be made in what we do, right, in terms of careers and jobs and doing good work in conservation. And we have a lot of market-based approaches to doing conservation, which, you know, there's a carrot and a stick approach to doing conservation. Right there, you know, if you ever tried to get a mule or a horse to move, you have the carrot, and you put that carrot in front of that horse or mule and lead that horse or mule to do what you want by incentivizing with that carrot. That's a better approach than taking a stick and whipping that horse or mule on the rear end to get them to do something, right? So these market-based approaches and economic incentives to do conservation are carrot approaches, as opposed to the old approach, which is a stick approach. You must do this, you must do that, because it's a good thing for somebody somewhere or some resource somewhere. That's the new paradigm in doing what we do. And we do, you know, we do work in that. I do research in that. We have students interested in that. We had a student come through our program, and she's done great work in her career and moving up and doing exactly that. She does wetland mitigation banking for the midstream for gas, which is gas transportation and pipelines. Right? So there's lots of careers paths in that way. And of course, our whole geospatial program, which is the way we analyze data. We have UAVs, uncrewed aerial vehicles, and we call it uncrewed aerial science, part of the geospatial workflow. So that's kind of like the new way we talk about these things. It's not just geographic information systems and remote sensing. I would call uncrewed aerial vehicles part of remote sensing, right? So the drone is just a platform in which we have the sensor. It could be a satellite platform, it could be an airplane platform, it could be a balloon platform. We just have these new platforms that carry sensors called UAVs, or commonly referred to as drones. But all of that together with GPS and cartography and geodesy and all these different elements of measuring the Earth, understanding the Earth, and really observing the Earth and analyzing the Earth's resources. We call that a geospatial approach, a geospatial workflow. So you really have to be proficient and, you know, approach expertise on all of those different components. And there's a lot of work in that, of course. So we prepare students for all of that. I usually give you too much information, guys, so you can stop me and interject whenever you want to.
I think you're trying to have an early night because you're just like going down the list of questions we had. That was pretty awesome. As you can see, Josh, this guy is awesome. He's going to try to make me take notes even though I'm recording this, just because he has a lot of wisdom. Yeah, Dr. Hoch was my first professor that I ever had the chance to meet at IUP. That was my first class I ever took, and I was blown away by the professionalism, but just his deep knowledge and understanding of what he's talking about. And again, he was just dropping one-liners and throwing mic drops around every time he got the chance to talk here, just for the last like 10 minutes, but really important stuff. And for people who don't know, I think that might have been, of all the guests we've had, that's up there as one of the best like openings we've ever had. I think seriously, of like any field. That was, I mean, Josh even
thanks,
was,
Thanks, Aaron. That's nice of you to say those things. And I've probably been in the business. I've been in academia maybe 20 years, 17 years here at IUP. I did some part-time work at West Virginia, but I've been involved with geospatial stuff since the 90s, right? So we're talking about the late 90s. And I guess that's ancient history to guys your age and to some of your viewers. So I have a longer term perspective. And we have other faculty here that have equally as long perspective or more. And so that helps, right? It's sometimes people think technology is about the latest, shiniest thing. And I might not be the best at the latest, shiniest thing, but I know how that latest and shiniest thing should fit into the workflow and the longer perspective and how it works. So that's nice of you to say. I mean, I worked at the Canaan Valley Institute. I worked at private firms, done work for Skelly and Loy. They've now got bought up, but they were a local firm that had regional offices in 5 states. And we did a lot of conservation work, a lot of watershed planning, a lot of Clean Water Act documentation, National Environmental Policy Act documentation, all required. And that's another thing, Josh, that you mentioned. That's another thing that we offer in our department is just learning how to do environmental documentation as conservation. Because it sounds like red tape, but you could think of it as being a maker of red tape, but most of the jobs that people have in conservation is the result of some enabling legislation that the federal government or the state government has crafted and adopted. So if it's not in that legislation, we really can't, in Pennsylvania, you don't have the right to do it. So that's the difference between Dillon's rule states and home rule states, what they call Cooley doctrine. But this is getting into land use law. So we offer courses in land use law too. So you know which states you're working in. So Virginia is a Dillon's rule state, Pennsylvania is a Dillon's rule state. You go further west, you have more what's called Cooley doctrine states, meaning in this instance, and again, I don't want to go off the rails on it too much, Aaron, but in Pennsylvania, you're only enabled to do what the state legislature says you can do. If it's not in the state statutes, you can't do it. In a Cooley doctrine state, it's the opposite. That's a home rule. So the premise is the state legislature only can tell you what you can't do as a local municipality or as a organization, right? And so understanding that kind of legal framework is part of the skill set that we provide. And how to navigate that to do what you want to do. We had some students from biology. I had a graduate student a couple of years ago. She was interested in bear conservation and documenting mass wasting of bears. What's that disease called? It's not like the deer disease. What is it?
I think it is chronic wasting disease.
Chronic wasting disease,
Sure
yes.
they both have it.
Yeah. So she was documenting that. And we did some geographically weighted regression and geospatial analysis to do that. And it worked out well, right? The problem was that the state manages bears based on county lines. And I don't really think bears care about county lines, right? When they're determining their range. They don't stop when they say, oh, I'm going into region 3 of the game commission, right? They don't really do that. And so understanding those kinds of obstructions and barriers, and we try to move past those barriers. And we have some great people moving out of our department, moving into higher positions. The head GIS person for the Pennsylvania Game Commission is one of our graduates. He gets it, he understands these, and he's changing how things are done. So, we think we have a good impact across the state. Pennsylvania has probably the most amount of local municipalities of anywhere in the United States. It depends if you're talking about Minnesota or Illinois, but Pennsylvania is. You guys have any idea how many local governments there are in Pennsylvania?
Is it based on counties?
Well, counties are 67
districts.
counties.
So it's
right?
based off of districts, right?
So no, I'm talking about either cities, boroughs, or townships. If you count all those up together,
Yeah.
It's probably one of the most.
Couple hundred?
There's
Thousands.
2,566 different local governments in Pennsylvania. And then
That's why my taxes are high.
it is one of the reasons why we have so many there. We don't share services. Now, we're enabled to share services, but local municipalities When I say enabled, I mean the state legislature has said, hey, all these little 5 square mile municipalities, you can share services. But many times the local municipalities don't want to do that. They want to keep their identity. They want to keep their local control. And so that's part of what a lot of urban planners deal with, right? So I'm dealing with water resource planning, but we have faculty that deal with urban planning and deal with how do you do that? How do you write a zoning ordinance, a conservation zoning ordinance? You can do that. You can say we're going to develop in a way that's conservation or ecologically based. And how do you do that when you have 2,566 local municipalities, 67 counties, 500 school districts, right? All different ways to tax, as you said, Josh, right? So all that political and economic stuff is not removed from conservation, right? As academics, we like to think in stovepipes, right? We want to think, well, I do this, and what I do is important. And it is, but if you want to be an agent of change, as I said, you have to understand all those different processes and how they interrelate. And that's what makes you like a really good professional person in moving forward conservation ideas or progressive ideas in conservation and trying to sustain certain landscapes. Or, the new term is resilient, how to be resilient to impacts. We've kind of given up that we're going to stop climate changes, right? We're like, that's out of the gate already. So how do we deal with it? How do we make communities more resilient? How do we make more habitat zones more resilient to climate change? And that's what we use with geospatial. That's when we use a lot of geospatial tools. We collect data remotely from UAVs ourselves. We can get access to data that's being flown, right, constantly by satellite. So every 14 days, there's certain satellites that pass over, some over more rapidly than that. But with a UAV, we can go out and collect data twice a day if it's needed for our research, right? So the temporal scale is much better, and the spatial scale and resolution is much better. So we have all these tools here, and now that we're in the College of Natural Sciences, we're teaming up with other groups in biology. Anthropology has also moved over here, so we maintain that human component. And we also are making relationships here at IUP. It sounds like I'm a sales pitch, but I'm not really trying to do a sales pitch. With public health, right? With the new medical school. And so the new dean of the medical school is really interested in community development and community health. And so we can measure that, right? We can analyze that. We can map that. We can do a lot of mapping of different kinds of population health metrics, understanding the enabling legislation that allows us to do that and what's required. There's so many overlaps from geography now. Geography is about the method, like Josh said, coming from an 8th grade science. You think, what's the capital of Kansas, right? But that's not what we do. I mean, we do that. We want to know our capitals, but we have maps for that. We don't have to memorize that. What we do is we think about spatial relationships. That's what geography is. It's not knowing where the capitals are or the countries of the world. While that's important, geographic knowledge is severely lacking in the United States. But we can study anything because we study the spatial relationships to things. Very different approach to standard other sciences. Geography is defined by the method we apply, which is spatial science and spatial relationships. And now we call that a geospatial science with all these new tools that we